The legend of the P-47 Thunderbolt's indestructibility began in blood and smoke over northern France. On June 26, 1943, that morning, 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group took off from RAF Horsham Street, faith in his olive-drab P-47C, codenamed Half Pint. His mission was a bomber escort run deep into occupied Europe, a task as perilous as it was routine. The Luftwaffe, still at the height of its power, prowled the skies over France with experienced fighter aces who had honed their craft since 1939. Johnson's group had only been flying the new Thunderbolt for a few months, and many pilots privately doubted its massive size and sluggish climb rate. Weighing nearly 8 tons fully loaded, the P-47 was heavier than most bombers of the previous war. Yet beneath its bulk lay an innovation that no one fully appreciated. A machine built not for elegance, but for survival. That morning, as Johnson climbed to 27,000 feet, his squadron was ambushed by a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s led by one of Germany's elite aces. Cannon shells erupted through the formation. Johnson's Thunderbolt was hit almost immediately. His canopy exploded. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. One cannon shell detonated in the fuselage behind his seat, tearing through the control cables. The engine sputtered, then roared again, belching black smoke. He was going down, or so everyone thought, as Johnson dove toward the French countryside. A lone FW-190 latched onto him. Its pilot, believed to be Major Heinz Br, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, closed to within 50 yards and began methodically raking the crippled Thunderbolt with cannon fire. Shell after shell slammed into the P-47's fuselage, wings, and engine cowling. Johnson later counted at least 21 cannon strikes and over 200 machine gun hits. The cockpit filled with the smell of gasoline, smoke, and burnt metal, but the P-47 didn't die. Despite shredded control surfaces and a punctured fuel tank, Johnson somehow managed to keep the Thunderbolt level. Burr, convinced his target was finished, flew alongside and signaled him to bail out. Johnson shook his head. Enraged, the German ace poured another burst of fire into the American fighter. When it still refused to fall, BR saluted, rolled inverted, and disappeared into the clouds. Miraculously, Johnson coaxed his ruined aircraft back across the English Channel and crash-landed at his home base. His plane was barely recognizable, riddled with holes, oil leaking from every seam. Yet it had protected him from a barrage that would have vaporized any other fighter in the world. The event shocked both sides. When word reached the Luftwaffe's intelligence officers, they refused to believe a single-engine fighter could withstand that level of punishment. But in hangars across southern England, Republic aviation engineers already knew why. The P-47 Thunderbolt, designed by the Georgian-born engineer Alexander Kartveli, was a machine born from an uncompromising philosophy: keep the pilot alive, no matter what it costs. Its airframe was built around the pilot like armor plating. Beneath the skin of aluminum were redundant hydraulic lines, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R280 engine that could take hits and still deliver power. Every design choice sacrificed agility for survivability, a trade that would soon redefine what it meant to fight and live in the skies over Europe. That day over France, the Luftwaffe learned something that would haunt its aces for the rest of the war. The Americans had built a fighter that could take hell itself and come home. News of Robert S. Johnson's survival spread quickly across both Allied and Axis air units. To the Americans, it was a morale-boosting legend in the making. To the Germans, it was a deeply unsettling revelation. Reports from Luftwaffe intelligence described the incident as mechanically improbable. Yet their own pilots, men like Heinz Br and the RAL, confirmed it in their debriefings. They had witnessed the Thunderbolt shrug off damage that would have torn a Bf-109 or FW-190 to pieces. Johnson's battered aircraft was photographed and studied by Republic engineers. The holes were counted, hundreds of punctures, shredded control cables, and a shot-up turbocharger system. Yet the cockpit armor, a thick steel plate behind the pilot's head and seat, remained intact. The engine, though leaking oil, still functioned. One mechanic described it as a flying tank with wings. Alexander Kartveli, the Thunderbolt's chief designer, had long believed that speed and firepower meant nothing without survivability. Unlike the sleek Spitfires or the lightweight Japanese Zeros, the P-47 was built around the engine and the pilot's safety. It was, as he once said, a fortress for one man. The enormous Pratt & Whitney R280 double wasp radial engine wasn't just powerful. It was nearly bulletproof. Unlike inline engines that failed when a coolant line was hit, the radial could take multiple cannon shells and keep spinning. The Luftwaffe soon began calling the Thunderbolt der Eisenhund, the Iron Dog, because, as one pilot wrote, it always comes back. German ace Gerhard Barkern, who had 301 aerial victories, noted that the P-47 seemed to absorb punishment unlike anything he had seen. You could set them on fire, and they would still be climbing. By late 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence reports warned that engaging P-47s head-on or in diving attacks was increasingly risky. The Thunderbolt's thick armor and robust airframe gave it an unmatched advantage in high-speed dives, where its mass and power made it almost untouchable. German pilots who followed Thunderbolts down often never came back up, but it wasn't just the airframe that terrified them, it was the philosophy behind it. American engineers treated aircraft not as handcrafted machines but as industrial products. Built for war's chaos, the P-47 was mass-producible, field-repairable, and reliable in any weather. Where Germany's advanced fighters demanded constant maintenance and perfect fuel, the Thunderbolt ran on anything the Allies had and flew in all conditions. As 1943 turned into 1944, these design principles began to rewrite the balance of air power. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin by fuel shortages and overwhelmed by Allied bombing, now faced a new kind of enemy pilot, one who flew a plane that could be hit, damaged, even torn apart, and still return to fight another day. And perhaps most demoralizing of all, the German aces began to realize that the Thunderbolt wasn't rare or elite. There were thousands more being built every month. The skies over Europe were filling with iron dogs, and they weren't going away. By early 1944, the European skies had become a brutal arena of attrition. The Luftwaffe still fielded some of the most skilled fighter pilots in history, men with hundreds of victories like Walter Nowotny, Adolf Galland, and Gerhard Barkern. But skill could no longer overcome numbers, nor the increasing technological and logistical might of the Allies. It was during this turning point that German airmen began to truly understand the full implications of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The revelation came not from propaganda or prisoner interrogations, but from wreck analysis. After several Thunderbolts were shot down over France and the Low Countries, German engineers at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret test center, began examining the remains. They were stunned. The armor protection around the cockpit and engine was unlike anything they had seen in a single-engine fighter. The fuel system was redundant and self-sealing, and many of the lines were placed deep within the fuselage, protected from direct fire. Most shocking of all was the aircraft's sheer structure. It was built with layers of redundancy, dual control cables, backup hydraulics, and a wing spar that could withstand extreme G-forces. One engineer reportedly commented, "This is not a fighter. It is a tank that flies." At that same time, German pilots were increasingly frustrated by their own machines. The Bf-109, though nimble, had become outdated and fragile. The FW-190 was powerful but mechanically demanding and vulnerable to heavy damage. Many Luftwaffe aces began to view the Thunderbolt with a mixture of respect and envy. They couldn't ignore what they saw: American pilots surviving in packs that would have obliterated any German fighter. One encounter over northern France became the subject of whispered legend in Luftwaffe circles. A formation of Thunderbolts escorting bombers to Rouen was ambushed by FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader 26. A single P-47 took at least 3 direct cannon hits before spinning away. The German pilots claimed the kill and returned to base. Hours later, reconnaissance photographs showed the same Thunderbolt parked safely at a forward light airstrip, its pilot alive, its fuselage riddled with holes. The incident deeply unsettled German morale. If American fighters could survive that much damage and still fly home, what chance did the Luftwaffe have in a long campaign? By this point, Luftwaffe ace the Verral, himself wounded multiple times in combat, publicly admitted, "We underestimated their machines. They are not elegant, but they are unstoppable." Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the Thunderbolt was quickly earning another reputation as a fearsome ground attack weapon. With 8 .50 caliber Browning machine guns and the ability to carry bombs and rockets, it became the scourge of German convoys, trains, and fuel depots. German infantry nicknamed it der Brillentod, the Screaming Death, for the terrifying sound it made during low-level attacks. Each passing month saw the Luftwaffe bleed pilots it could not replace. While German aces still scored kills, they began to recognize a grim truth: they were no longer fighting equals. They were fighting an industrial machine. And the Thunderbolt, indestructible and numerous, was the visible proof that the war in the air was turning irrevocably against them. The Luftwaffe still had faster planes, and sometimes better climbers, but none that could take the punishment of a P-47 and bring its pilot home. That, more than anything, began to break the spirit of Germany's fighter elite. By spring 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from a misunderstood brute into the backbone of the Allied air campaign over Europe. American pilots affectionately called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a fitting name for an aircraft that embodied raw power and endurance. To many U.S. airmen, flying a P-47 meant one thing: survival. At bases scattered across England, Duxford, Debden, Boxted, aircrews worked around the clock to keep the massive radial engine fighters operational. Each takeoff was a controlled explosion. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp roared to life, with a deafening growl that shook hangars and sent mechanics covering their ears. With over 2,000 horsepower, the Thunderbolt was graceful, but it was unstoppable once airborne. Pilots quickly learned that the P-47 could take abuse that would destroy any other plane. Stories circulated through the 8th Air Force of Thunderbolts limping home on a single-cylinder bank, half a wing shredded, or a tail nearly shot off. Lieutenant Frank Euler famously returned to base with his engine oil completely drained, guided only by gravity and luck. Others landed safely after losing control surfaces or suffering direct hits to the cockpit armor plate. The Germans began calling it der Panzerjäger, der nicht stirbt, the tank hunter that doesn't die. Luftwaffe aces like Erich Hartmann and Heinz Br, who once dismissed the P-47 as too heavy to dogfight, began warning younger pilots not to engage Thunderbolts head-on. The aircraft's sheer durability made even accurate gunnery feel futile. You could empty a cannon into it, one German report read, and it would still fly. American design philosophy had reached full maturity with the P-47. Alexander Kartvel's team at Republic Aviation had designed redundancy into every system, something German engineers rarely prioritized. Dual ignition, self-sealing fuel tanks, armored cockpits, and thick steel plating protected vital components. The 8th Air Force's statistics told the story clearly. The Thunderbolt had the lowest pilot loss rate of any fighter in Europe, but survivability was its only strength. When used for ground attack, the P-47 became a weapon of terror. Armed with 8 .50 caliber Browning M2s, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute, the Jug could shred trains, convoys, and columns of infantry in seconds. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe logistics officers reported that simply hearing the distant roar of a Thunderbolt formation often caused troops to abandon vehicles and scatter. Even British commanders, who had once favored their sleek Spitfires, began to acknowledge that the American machine was redefining air warfare. It wasn't elegant like a Spitfire or nimble like a Bf-109. It was something new, a mass-produced fortress that brought industrial power directly into the sky. For the Americans, that was the point. They weren't building aces machines like Germany did, they were building pilots' machines, aircraft. That turned survival into a strategic advantage. Every pilot who came home could fight again the next day. Every German ace shot down, no matter how experienced, was gone forever. By the summer of 1944, the Jug's reputation was cemented. It wasn't just feared, it was respected, even among its enemies. There was a grim acknowledgement that no single fighter symbolized America's industrial invincibility more than the P-47 Thunderbolt. It wasn't fast enough to win every duel, but it never lost a war. By the time Allied forces prepared for D-Day in June 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had transformed from a defensive escort fighter into the ultimate weapon of air domination. In the skies above France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, Thunderbolts became the visible expression of Allied power, loud, unrelenting, and everywhere at once. Each morning, entire squadrons of Jugs thundered off English runways in waves, climbing toward the Channel. From their cockpits, pilots could see the endless armada of landing craft and Liberty ships below. Their mission was clear: protect the invasion, destroy the Luftwaffe, and annihilate anything German that moved. In the first days after the Normandy landings, German commanders were horrified to realize that their armored reinforcements couldn't reach the beaches. Roads were littered with the smoldering remains of tanks, trucks, and half-tracks, all victims of Thunderbolt attacks. Flying at treetop height, P-47 pilots unleashed devastating firepower, rockets, 500-pound bombs, and streams of .50 caliber bullets that could melt through steel. a Luftwaffe intelligence officer wrote in his June 10, 1944, report, "The Americans have built a tank that flies. It is not fast, but it cannot be stopped." Even the feared German flak batteries, which had decimated bomber formations a year earlier, struggled to bring down the rugged jugs. Pilots returned from missions with wings shredded, canopies cracked, and engines running on half power, yet they kept flying. In one extraordinary mission over Saint-Tel, a Thunderbolt from the 56th Fighter Group was hit by 88mm anti-aircraft fire. That blew away most of its tail. The pilot, Captain William Shorty Rankin, not only managed to stay airborne, but actually strafed another target before returning to base, an incident later confirmed in official U.S. Army Air Forces records. While the Thunderbolts ruled the skies, the Luftwaffe was bleeding to death. Years of attrition and fuel shortages had reduced German pilot training to just 100 flight hours. Before combat, facing the battle-hardened Americans, they stood little chance. The P-47's heavy guns and sheer endurance turned every encounter into a one-sided brawl. Even experienced German aces began to describe Thunderbolts as flying fortresses in miniature. But perhaps the most devastating weapon wasn't its firepower, it was its reliability. Unlike the delicate German aircraft that required constant maintenance and high-octane fuel, the P-47 could operate from rough forward airstrips, take enormous damage, and be back in the air within hours. The Allies had created a fighter perfectly suited for total war, easy to build, easy to maintain, and impossible to kill. By late summer 1944, the Luftwaffe's remaining fighter units had retreated deep into Germany. For the first time in the war, American pilots owned the European sky. The Thunderbolt had helped make it happen, and while many pilots later traded their jugs for sleeker P-51 Mustangs, those who flew the P-47 never forgot what it had done. As one ace from the 78th Fighter Group put it years later, the Mustang won the headlines. The Thunderbolt won the war. When the war finally ended in 1945, thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts stood lined up on airfields from Normandy to Okinawa, battle-worn, oil-stained, and proud. Many bore the scars of combat, patched bullet holes, scorched paint, and hastily replaced engines. Yet remarkably, most were still airworthy. It was a visual testament to their extraordinary design, machines that had not only survived war, but had outlasted it. Historians later calculated that the P-47 had flown over 500,000 combat sorties, destroying 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and over 150,000 vehicles, locomotives, and armored targets on the ground. No other fighter in the world combined that level of durability, firepower, and versatility. Even the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces came to respect and fear it. In post-war interviews, several German pilots admitted that attacking a Thunderbolt was a waste of ammunition. As one recalled, you could hit them again and again, and they kept flying straight at you. But beyond its record, the Thunderbolt symbolized something deeper: the triumph of American engineering philosophy. Alexander Kartvel's decision to design a fighter around the Pratt and Whitney R280 double Wasp engine had seemed reckless to some at first. It made the plane heavy, even ungainly compared to the elegant Bf-109 or Spitfire. Yet the engine's raw power, combined with rugged construction and redundant systems, created an aircraft that embodied the industrial might and practical mindset of the United States. It was not a masterpiece of beauty, it was a masterpiece of reliability. The men who flew it loved it for exactly that reason. In pilot debriefs, they often referred to their aircraft as a friend who would take a punch for you. Many credited the P-47 for saving their lives multiple times. One veteran, Captain Robert Duckdon, described his first mission over Germany. "We hit heavy flak. My wing was shredded, half my instruments were gone, and oil was covering the canopy. But she flew me home. Any other plane, I'd have been a name on a wall." After the war, Thunderbolts continued to serve, not just in the U.S. Air Force, but across the world. France, Italy, Brazil, Mexico, and even Yugoslavia operated P-47s well into the 1950s. In Latin America, they became symbols of post-war modernization in the new NATO air forces. They were training platforms for a generation of Cold War pilots. Today, only a few dozen remain airworthy, but their legacy endures. Each surviving jug represents not only the resilience of the pilots who flew it, but also the industrial heart of a nation that built 15,683 of them in just 4 years. In every sense, the P-47 Thunderbolt was proof that victory in the air was not merely about speed or agility. It was about endurance, production, and the will to keep flying no matter how much damage you took. As one German ace would later confess during a post-war symposium on aerial combat, "We underestimated America. We built perfection. They built power, and power won."